Hello everybody and welcome to a special presentation from D.L.Soucy Productions on the truth and history of the Second Amendment. I've been asked to provide my 2 bits worth of information into the discussion over gun control. And excuse me, there's a lot of widely disparate positions in the gun control debate. On the one hand, you have these people that will drape themselves in a flag and wave the Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. And you go to the far opposite extremes, and they seem to think that nobody should have a gun for any reason, purpose, or need whatsoever. But this is the United States of America. We have daily pledge allegiance to the flag. And our Constitution is our binding governmental document that not only gives us a core concept of what we should be doing, but also a core concept of what the government should be doing. And that's what the Second Amendment is all about, along with the other 9 amendments. And we're going to go back through a little bit of the history and a little bit of the discussion over why the Second Amendment is so important. Yes, it is just as important today as it was, over 200 years ago when the Constitution was ratified. But we'll get into a little bit of the history here. Second Amendment. The United States Constitution includes several ratified amendments which became part of the Constitution, as you're all aware of. The first 10 amendments, which were not ratified at the same time as the Constitution, are popularly referred to as the Bill of Rights. Everybody knows that the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. Don't seem to understand that the first 10 amendments were not part of the Constitution when it was ratified. It wasn't until a couple of years later that happened. The Second Amendment has become hotly debated and a misunderstood particle of a greater document. The Second Amendment states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And this is one sentence, and it has several ideas in that sentence. And every time you make a sentence, what you are doing is you're sharing an idea or a fact or a suggestion or whatever. But this is a multi-part sentence, and we're going to be getting into a little bit of what this all means. But they all tie in together into one core ideal of security. 27 words. Today they become a battleground that will define the future of this nation, whether we like it or not. And the intent and meaning of this amendment has been seriously misunderstood, wrongly interpreted, and portrayed in many different ways by many different special interest positions over the last few decades. The gun interests claim that gun ownership is a God-given right. This isn't actually true. This is a man-given right. The only right that God gives us is the right to inherit the tree of life. And it's there for anybody that wants to claim that. And if you want some more information on that, talk to your local minister or send me a private message and we'll go into that. But gun interest, while they claim that it's a God-given right, it is not a God-given right. I don't care what anybody says. When you try to say that something is God-given, you really should be sure of what you're talking about. And the anti-gun interests claim that it was meant that only militias may be armed. And still a third interest claims this amendment is no longer relevant to America's interest and should be removed from the Constitution. And I could go on and on and on. There, for as many people as there are in this country, there are a position on gun control. But in the end, is the argument really about gun rights? What is the Second Amendment all about? And is the anti-gun movement really about gun control? These are 3 questions that have to be assessed whenever you get into a discussion concerning gun rights and gun control and what it's all about. But let's take a look at the questions and the history behind this very controversial piece of our Constitution that we call the Second Amendment. What is the U.S. Constitution? What is the Bill of Rights? And why are they often considered to be part of the same document? It's three separate questions, but they generally all get wrapped up into the same answer. More importantly, why is the Bill of Rights so important to the sanctity and security of the United States Constitution? And why does the Second Amendment play such a pivotal role in this discussion? Why is it so important? Why is it more important than the other 9 amendments that were included in the Bill of Rights? Well, we all know what our Constitution is, or so we think we know. Many consider the U.S. Constitution to be one of our founding documents, and that it received unanimous approval from our founding fathers. And many also believe that the Bill of Rights are simply an extended clauses to the Constitution. I will look at a couple of those statements here, and we'll find that it really isn't quite the case. Let's look at the facts and the questions. First, the U.S. Constitution is not truly a founding document. It can be considered a foundational document, but not a founding document. There are really only 2 founding documents that can be considered in this discussion. Number 1 is the Declaration of Independence, which we all know was signed and adopted into practice on July 4th of 1776. And 2, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which were put into practice that very day in real life. The Declaration of Independence was adopted and put into effect on July 4th of 1776, as we all know. It was a statement that declared that the 13 American colonies considered themselves to be free from British rule and were a nation unto themselves. The Declaration of Independence was the beginning of a new nation and a new ideal. And this new nation was based upon an ideal of freedom from a centralized control, recognizing the rights, responsibilities, and the right of individuals to be sovereign and independent, both as individual citizens and as subjects to a new government. The Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, normally referred to as simply the Articles of Confederation, was the founding document that laid out what type of government this new nation was to be governed by. This document placed great emphasis on the sovereignty of the 13 individual states and its individual citizens. The U.S. Constitution was not created until it was adopted by a Constitutional Convention on September 17th of 1787. It was ratified by only 11 of the 13 states, taking effect on March 4th of 1789. So you see, it wasn't until many years after the founding of this country that the Constitution actually became a legal document, and it was not unanimously upheld, as many people seem to think it was. The Bill of Rights was not added to the Constitution until ratification on December 15th of 1791. And that was nearly 15 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. So again, these documents, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, can hardly be considered founding documents. Again, they are what we consider foundational documents. They are documents that our foundation is built upon, but they are not founding documents. The Articles of Confederation was the original charter document which laid out the intent and procedures for the government of the new nation at the federal level. Well, it was a good guiding document for the formation of this nation. The tendency of the states was to ignore their responsibilities to the greater good of the federal level government. There were a lot of problems whereby a lot of the bills that the federal government owed were not getting paid in a timely fashion because they were not able to raise the revenue because the individual states were bickering between each other over who should be paying the bills. The bigger states thought that they should be paying less, it should be paid equally amongst all the states, and I could go on and on and on, but I won't because it's not really germane to this discussion. And there were other problems as well, but it became clear that a solution had to be found if we were to become recognized by other governments as a valid entity. And that solution became the U.S. Constitution. But even then, there were problems with the final version. And the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were meant to resolve those problems. And when it came time to resolve the issues posed by the Articles of Confederation, there were several political agendas that all demanded satisfaction with the new document. Much debate occurred prior to the final version, of course, and continued on after it was accepted by the convention and sent to the states for ratification. The two main political positions at the time, and actually still are today in spite of all of the many formal political parties that exist today and through the years. We've seen the Republican Party, original Republican Party, the Democrats, the Whigs, the new Republican Party under Lincoln's leadership. Today we have the Independents, we have the Greens, we have this, we have that. All kinds of people want to have a party. But nobody wants to get together and have the same party. So we have to backtrack here to political positions, and many times we confuse political positions with economic positions, and we talk about the socialists and the communists and the capitalists and these types of things, and these are actually more properly considered as economic positions and not political positions. There are really only two positions in the political arena that need to be considered here. Number one is the Federalist position, and number two is the Anti-Federalist position. Now, unfortunately, this aspect of American politics has been ignored and swept aside in favor of today's current party system of politics. The Federalist ideology promotes a larger, stronger, more centralized power. And this, as much as I hate to say it, is very similar to what the communists like and the socialists like to see in their governments, because it becomes much easier to control the economy. One central planning committee can cause a lot of problems, but they can also solve a lot of problems in some people's minds. Not mine, but in some people's minds. But this is what the Federalist ideology is all about. It's a centralized power that has most, if not all, of the legal, legislative power and ruler power. The Anti-Federalist ideology promotes a smaller, centralized government with less power over the individual. And we have to stop and take a look at sovereignty for a second. The original ideology that this nation was founded on was the right of individual sovereignty. And what we could do is stand back and take a look at the whole picture and say that state power trumps federal power, and county power trumps state power, and local power trumps county power, and individual power trumps local power. Most people don't want to see this, and to a point I can see, I can concede where they may be right. There has to be some sort of a common ground leadership or legislative position where the rights of the individual are protected and promoted, but we still have the need to protect and secure the harmony of the greater good of the people. So somewhere in between there, we have to find a balance that everybody can accept and accommodate. But the bottom line is all political parties adhere to one of these two extremes, no matter what their party platform says. We have the Republicans and we have the Democrats in power today. And we also have what is now up and coming, a new leadership paradigm known as the Libertarian Party, which is one that I support myself. I don't believe and I don't agree with everything that the Libertarian platform stands for, but as nations go, I think the Libertarian Party is probably the one that will most closely adhere to what our founding fathers really saw this nation as being. But at any rate, as I said, all political parties adhere to one of these two extremes, no matter what their party platform says. And today, it's kind of like, there's an old saying that I'm going to go over in a moment here. But most of the politicians today, whether they be Democrat or Republican or whatever, adhere to the federalist position. They want a bigger centralized government. They want more government power. They want bigger government. And like I said, there's an old saw that says all politicians want to get to the back of the barn. The only difference between them is which side of the barn they choose to go around to get there. The Democrats go down the left side, the Republicans go down the right side. Conservatives go down the right side, and the liberals go down the left side. But they all get to the back of the barn. But they miss a very important fact. The back of the barn is where the farmer puts all the manure. And I think everybody that's listening to this video, if you've hung on for this long, can agree with that. They're all going to the same place, and they're all going to wind up in the same pile of manure. But politics is politics. Today, both the Republicans and the Democrats desire a larger, more powerful, centralized government, with the states taking a subsidiary role and forced to make their own legislation comply with the federal regulations. And you can see this in effect and practice today by taking a look at the Affordable Care Act, more popularly known as the Abomination Care. It's an unconstitutional law that requires people to buy insurance, and we'll get into that maybe in another video. If there's enough support for this video and I get enough views, maybe I'll do one on the Obamacare and why it's not quite what everybody thinks it is. But we'll get into that in another story maybe. So anyhow, how does all this tie into today's question of the issues surrounding the Second Amendment and gun control and or regulation? To answer that question, we must first understand what the Bill of Rights is and why these 10 amendments were added to our Constitution. And we must also understand why, if it was so important, it was not included in the main body of the Constitution. Now remember, it was a couple of years after the ratification of the Constitution that the Bill of Rights was ratified. And we also have to be aware that there are many different answers to these questions being shared today, but there is only one right answer, in spite of the multitude of opinions on this matter. The true answer lies in the battle between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist ideologies. Briefly, the political climate of the time that the Constitution was enacted was one where the Federalists were gaining more and more power. And a lot of people don't understand this or realize it, but the Federalists were actually the driving force behind the Constitution. The basic premise of the Constitutional Convention, where our new Constitution came from, was actually intended to change the Articles of Confederation somewhat to take care of some of the problems that were cropping up with us being accepted as a new nation with the rest of the world and getting our bills paid. But however, the memory of English rule over the colonies was still strong within most of the adults of the time, and you have to remember that most of these people, if not all of the people that were really driving this new Constitution, were well aware of the excesses imposed upon us by the English crown. But they pretty much nearly all the adults that were alive at that time experienced that rule firsthand to some extent. And they wanted to create this new nation, and they wanted to change it in such a way that those excesses were not going to ever rear their ugly heads again. It turned out they weren't quite right in what they did, but that's the story for another day. The Anti-Federalists feared that if a strong federal government was instilled and accepted, it would become an elitist power, similar to the Crown style of government leadership. Kind of what you see today, actually. But This would eliminate the aspect of individual and state sovereignty that was fought so hard for in the war for independence from England. Now, a lot of people are under the misconception that the argument and the reason that we wanted freedom from Britain was, or England was, simply about taxes, and this really isn't true. If you do the history and you look back at the statistics of the time, the English colonies here in America were actually enjoyed the lowest levels of taxation of all of the colonies that England controlled. The Crown colonies made a lot of money out of taxation, but again, comparatively speaking, the American colonies were actually taxed at a lower rate than most of the other colonies. So it wasn't entirely about the taxation. Part of the problem was that the taxes were based upon and whatever was imported at that time. Income tax was pretty much unheard of at the time. Part of the problem was that anything that was sold in the American colonies had to come from English soil. So if somebody wanted to, say, make a shovel in West Virginia and sell it to somebody in Pennsylvania, that shovel actually had to be shipped to England and back to the colonies to be sold to somebody in Pennsylvania. And that's where part of the problem was, is the amount of control that the Crown had over the individual citizens of the colonies. But at any rate, that would eliminate the aspect of individual and state sovereignty that was fought so hard for in independence from England. So you had two different kinds, or two different points of argument there. Both of them were right, but both of them were wrong. And instead of coming to an agreeable situation where everybody would come out a winner, the ultimate result of that argument back in those days was that we have a government that we have today, which has increasing and too much power and too much control over the individual and the states. But while the Constitution was being ratified, the Anti-Federalists continued to battle against a strong centralized government, striving for a counterbalance to the situation where all parties felt would inevitably ensue. A solution to the problems was what we now call the Bill of Rights, and included the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. These 10 amendments provided the individual citizens protection from the federal government, and was to provide for an avenue for the redress of grievances from federal power. Essentially, these 10 amendments gave an individual the right to speak out against the government, worship as they chose, petition the government for redress from grievances, protect themselves from others, peaceably assemble, along with many other rights. And these rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights were intended to keep the individual free from an oppressive government. We get into a situation where the laws and regulations that the government passes and enacts, legal or not. Another video will be coming up on that possibly. But let's get back to the issue here. The Second Amendment addresses the issue of self-protection. And this issue has become hotly contested today. Many states and municipalities have enacted multitudinous gun restriction laws contrary to the purpose of the Second Amendment. Now let's take a closer look at this amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And what exactly does this mean to us today, and what did it mean 225 years ago when it was ratified? Well, it's actually a two-part sentence, with both ideas espoused being of equal importance. Now let's break it down into understandable terms for a moment. The first idea entails the need for a state militia as opposed to a federal standing army to be used as protection for the states and communities. The idea states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state shall not be infringed. If we take out the part about individual security, this is what the Second Amendment would look like. Like I said, there are a multitude of ideas in this one sentence, and one of those is that the states and security is essential to a free state, and it shall not be infringed. So we have a sentence that says a well-regulated militia, and the reason for the well-regulated militia is that it is necessary to the security of a free state, and it shall not be infringed. And this means, again, that the militia is necessary for the protection of the greater community, essentially intended as a means to provide for defense of the individual states from aggression from other states and or nations. You have to remember that at this time there were a lot of bickering going on between the states, and in fact, I believe it was Rhode Island was making threats and had actually crossed the border into Massachusetts to gain back ground that they thought was theirs, and a couple of other arguments were going on like that. But it was quite possible for one state to invade the other state, and of course, that wasn't something that was good to happen, no matter how you looked at it. But the federal government shall not prohibit the establishment nor maintenance of these state militia units. And of course, we've seen over the years that this part of the Second Amendment has pretty much gone by the wayside. The militia that was intended to be in existence by this Second Amendment is not the militia that we have today. The militia of those days was actually a state-level military unit, and we can get into various other portions of the Constitution that supports that, but we won't for this conversation because it'll take too long. But it's supposed to be a organized and recognized by the state as being a military unit that is necessary for the protection of the greater community. Today, mostly what you have in your militias is not a constitutionally mandated militia, but, and I know you're not going to like to hear this, a bunch of angry white men waving their guns around. But much as I want to get into the discussion here, I'm not going to. We'll continue on here. The federal government shall not prohibit the establishment nor maintenance of these free state militia units. And of course, you've seen over the years that this concept is practically a foreign word. Again, most people, when they look at militia, they look at these angry white men waving their, AKs and all kinds of different weaponry, claiming that it's their God-given right to do so. Of course, this isn't really true, but that's one side of the extremist ends of the arguments. And over the years, the federal government has removed the use of these state militias and replaced them with what we commonly call the National Guard today. National Guard, where the state militias are not supposed to have anything to do with the federal government, is simply a state-level military unit. But why has this happened? Well, the real answer is long and convoluted, but essentially, as the dangers from mass uprising and foreign invasion dissipated, we became content, felt safe, and for the most part failed to pay attention as this occurred. During the War of the Revolution, when Abraham Lincoln invaded the new country that we call the Confederate States of America, much of what we took for granted in the Constitution was thrown by the wayside by the new Republican government. It wasn't constitutionally acceptable for them to do that, but they got away with it because the people allowed it, because again, that's a situation and a discussion that's going to take too long to get into, so we won't here. This presentation is about gun rights today, so we'll get into the meat of the matter. The second idea established through the Second Amendment says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is a pretty simple concept, plainly stated, and should be no cause for animated discussion, and yet it is, and most people have no idea why it has really become the issue it has today. The amendment plainly states that we, the people, have the right to keep and bear arms. It is in fact part of our Constitution, and as such is a right granted to all citizens. And yet some factions would remove that right, in effect abridging or removing that right without changing the Constitution of this nation. Is it feasible or even allowable to change or abridge our constitutionally guaranteed rights through simple legislative or judicial means, without first repealing that portion of our Bill of Rights? In a word, no. There are some who argue that amendments are not part of the Constitution and are subject to change according to the will of the people. However, this is not true. There were actually 12 amendments sent to the states for ratification from a total of 124 that were debated in Congress, and only 10 of those 12 were ratified at the time. The statement transmitted to the states by our Congress, supported by at least a two-thirds vote of both the House and the Senate, contained the following resolution. And I'm only going to do this in part. It's actually quite a bit longer than this, but this is the pertinent part of this conversation. Resolved by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America, aka Congress, that the following articles be proposed as amendments to the Constitution of the United States, which articles, when ratified, to be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the said Constitution. And what this means is that this package of amendments that was sent to the states for ratification, when they became ratified, were going to be part of the Constitution. Not a separate document to be manhandled as anybody wanted to, but part of the Constitution. And that's why the Bill of Rights is such an important document today. It's not separate from the Constitution. It is part of the Constitution, even though it was ratified a couple of years after the ratification of the main portion of the document of the Constitution of the United States. And this means, of course, that the amendments are as valid and necessary as the Constitution is to us today. The U.S. Constitution, along with the first 10 amendments, are considered to be one document, and one must accept it in its entirety or not at all. We cannot pick and choose which portions of the Constitution we find valid. In spite of what some believe, our acceptance of the U.S. Constitution is an all or none situation. We take it in its entirety or we reject it in its entirety. And this is the part that most people seem to have a problem with today, its precepts apply to all citizens of this nation equally without exception. Equality in law and rights is what makes this nation exceptional. And let's revisit the statement that the presentation is about today. The second idea established through the Second Amendment says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, like I said, some people seem to have a hard time understanding the term shall not. Why is the Second Amendment so important, and why are so many interests seeking to destroy this particular amendment? That's one question. Why not seek to eliminate the third example for amendment, for example? It's a pretty simple amendment. It doesn't really mean much today. Never actually has. But what is it about this amendment that makes it so important in today's culture and political arenas? The answer to those questions lie in the reason it was included in the Bill of Rights in the first place. So, again, let's look at what this Second Amendment means and why it is in the Bill of Rights and why it has become such a divisive issue today. Now remember that the Second Amendment contains two separate ideas. They both refer to the same purpose. And these are the two ideas we are looking at. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We have the right to two things based on this amendment. We have the right to maintain a state militia of armed citizens, and number two, we have the right to possess firearms and to carry them about our persons. Both of these rights provide a means of armed and equal protection from hostile elements. The militia allows us to protect our states from foreign invasion. The militia is intended to be a separate military body from the federal military and under complete control of the states. The second portion allows us to protect and defend ourselves and our property from hostile events on a personal nature. So essentially, the Second Amendment is the clause that creates a need as well as a responsibility for self-protection from others. These others can be non-human as well as human-form dangers, such as an invasion from non-American forces, as well as a criminal that lives on the next block. Those who say the Second Amendment is not necessary state that we have the military to protect us from foreign dangers and law enforcement to protect us from local dangers. Why do we need to possess firearms? And of course the answer is self-apparent for anyone interested enough to dig beyond the emotion-packed headlines of today. The suggestion is also made that the world is different today than it was when the amendments were ratified, and therefore the amendment is no longer relevant. Really? If this is true, then none of the other amendments are relevant today as well. If we no longer feel we require the Second Amendment, then perhaps we also no longer require the rights afforded us in the rest of the first 10 amendments either. Imagine what it would be like if we had no right to a freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government. Imagine what it would be like if we no longer had the right to legal counsel, being arrested without charges, no speedy and impartial trials, or any of the other rights granted to the people accused or of crime or other wrongdoing. Imagine what it would be like if the government were allowed to search your homes without a warrant, seize your personal and real property without compensation or reason. Now, these are ideals that are threaded throughout not only this Bill of Rights but the entire Constitution. These three ideals are security, freedom, and equality. These 10 amendments provide a platform that demands these ideals are forever kept in trust by both the citizens as well as the government of this nation. The loss of any one of the rights granted in these 10 amendments guarantees the eventual loss of the rest of our rights. Even now, these rights are being eroded, and most of us are unaware of this fact. Why is it so important that our Second Amendment rights be removed? Let's take a look back at the political climate of the 18th century. At the time, the political climate of this new nation was seriously fractured. There were two main political agendas, and the two political agendas were widely disparate from one another, just like today. In fact, you could say that for all intents and purposes, there really has been no change in the core political ideology and climate of this nation for over 230 plus years. The names have changed and party ideologies have changed, but we still only have two core ideologies, federalism and anti-federalism. So, why are we just debating the need and purpose for the Second Amendment only now? Why wasn't this an issue a century ago? What has changed in the picture that makes this an issue today? Is it true that there is no need for this amendment today? Well, the answers to those questions are simple enough, and yet complicated enough to comprehend in their full potential. Firstly, we need the rights afforded us by the Second Amendment more than ever, and secondly, the biggest reason the Second Amendment has become such an issue is because a third political ideology has come upon the scene. And this ideology is an extreme threat to the sovereignty and sanctity of this nation's future. This new political ideology is called globalism and seeks to realign the sovereignty of all nations into something under the control of one worldwide centralized government. We call that governing body today the UN. But let's go back to the time of ratification of this amendment for a moment. Now, why is it so important for the individuals to have rights to possess and use firearms or weapons of any kind for that matter? And the answer lies in the purpose of the Second Amendment. And that purpose is to provide for the security of the state as well as the individual. You cannot maintain your freedom if you do not have security. Second Amendment provides us with a means to protect ourselves from invasion or assault from other entities, nations and states on the community or state level, as well as against criminal elements on the individual level. It also secures us a means to provide for defense from our own corruptions. Our founding fathers recognized the dangers both present and not present, and the Second Amendment details or fulfills the needs to guarantee our rights to defense. Now, Thomas Jefferson is probably one of the most revered and quoted and misquoted of our founding fathers, and of the need to bear arms, he wrote in a letter to a gentleman by the name of Peter Miner. And here he was sending a gift to Mr. Miner's son, I believe it was, if I remember correctly. But he wrote, "I presume he is a gunman, as I am sure he ought to be, and every American who wishes to protect his farm from the ravages of quadrupeds in his country from those of biped invaders." So we see this was a common thread throughout the early years of this nation. Defense and security was of utmost importance, and it was something that was basically required of every citizen. Everybody needed to know how to defend themselves. That, of course, changed over the years. That not the need to protect themselves and to be secure, but the idea that every person was responsible for their own security and safety. Many of the anti-gun groups state that there is no need for defense against wild animals, and it is wrong to kill wild animals for meat, as it is easily obtained. And we have the military and police departments of this nation for protection, so we have no need for firearms for national nor individual protection. That's their claim anyways. And the anti-gun lobby also claims that stricter gun controls will prevent gun crimes from happening, as these laws abrogating, and that's exactly what they do, our Second Amendment rights, will eliminate firearms from public possession and make it impossible for criminals to obtain firearms. Nice theory, but is it a practical theory? Let's take a look. There are literally hundreds upon hundreds of data sets presenting a wide range of statistical information that can be presented and or manipulated in such a way as to provide support for either side of the argument. However, one trend is certain and cannot be ignored. The data says that the number of homicides in this nation continues to increase, and it is increasing in areas that have the strictest local gun control measures. This means that in a situation that makes it illegal to possess a firearm, gun crimes still occur, and they occur in increasing rates. Let's take a look at one set of statistics that of our nation's capital, which really should be a leader of communities. Of course, we know that this isn't true, but it's neither here nor there for this discussion. In 1976, the Washington, D.C. City Council passed a law generally prohibiting residents from possessing handguns and requiring that all firearms in private homes be kept unloaded and or rendered temporarily inoperable via disassembly or installation of a trigger lock. This means that essentially it became impossible to use firearms as a means of defense from invasion. Now, of course, this law that was supposed to eliminate guns from use in crimes and murders resulted in the homicide rate in D.C. skyrocketing after imposition of the law, reached a shockingly high rate of about 79% of all homicides in the early 90s in the D.C. Community. U.S. average for the time frame was actually only 11%. So you see this community, or D.C., our nation's capital, in their misguided attempt to prevent homicides by gun, actually caused an increase in the rates of homicides by gun. In 2008, this D.C. gun ban and trigger lock law was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Homicide rate for the following year was down to 23%. Still higher than the national average, but much lower than the 79% it reached during the Prohibition. Why? Well, because when a criminal encounters a situation of resistance, they tend to not commit the crime. When a person is secure, they are secure. Second Amendment guarantees us the right of self-defense, but that defense is only practicable if that defense is equal to or greater than those who would violate our security. In other words, as is so frequently stated, if we ban guns, only criminals will have guns. That makes us defenseless against a superior power. It is common sense and can be demonstrated time and again, both from a statistical position as well as a real-world position. So let's take a look at how well we are protected by governmental agents in situations where the public is unarmed. Well, on April 2nd of this year, 2014, there were 3 killed and 16 injured in Fort Hood, Texas. September 16th of 2013, there were 13 killed and 3 injured in Washington, D.C. June 7th of 2013, there were 5 killed in Santa Monica. December 14th, 2012, there were 27 killed and 1 injured in Newtown, Connecticut. On October 21st of 2012, there were 3 dead, 4 injured in Brookfield, Wisconsin. September 28th, 2012, there were 6 killed, 2 injured in Minneapolis, Minnesota. August 5th of 2012, 6 killed, 3 injured, Oak Creek, Wisconsin. July 20th, 2012, 12 killed, 58 injured in Aurora, Colorado. April 2nd of 2012, 3 killed, 3 injured in Oakland. October 12th of 2011, 8 killed, 1 injured in Seal Beach, California. Should I continue? I think you probably get my point of where I'm going here. In each of these scenes where horrific mass or multiple killings were committed, there were no individuals that were carrying firearms for defense. And in most cases, all mass shootings occur in areas that are known as gun-free zones. What is a gun-free zone? And if it is gun-free, how are the shootings able to be carried out? Gun-free zones are not wholly an American ideal, but an idea espoused by the United Nations as part of their disarmament program. Essentially, the program seeks to eliminate uncontrolled possession of weapons in certain areas for the purpose of reducing violence. Sounds like a good idea, but is it? Does it work? Not really. Unfortunately, there is a side effect created when one promotes a gun-free society. And that side effect is that not having a means of defense allows one to become the victim of a crime of any nature. Not just a gun crime. The threat of a violence by a gun becomes enhanced, not diminished, when defense actions are prohibited. But there are other aspects involved in this political ideology of establishing gun-free zones for the betterment of society. For instance, many areas of South Africa proudly adhere to the idea of gun-free zones and have substantially eliminated the presence of guns in those areas. Unfortunately, the absence of the weapons for personal protection merely exacerbates the ability for extremist groups and opposing factions to bully and otherwise coerce the public into complying with their demands, especially with regards to the ballot process. Many elections that have enabled despots to take positions of power have occurred with the help of these gun-free zones. But this is the United States, right? Things like that can't happen here, can they? A couple of interesting questions, and you won't like the answers, because actually it can. Even today, the rights guaranteed us by the Bill of Rights are being slowly lost. If you're a Christian, for example, you are now prohibited the free expression of your faith in many places. As another example, the government is ignoring the Fourth Amendment through its operations of the NSA. We are protected from warrantless searches by this amendment, and yet the news reports are flooded with stories of cell phone and online activity being intercepted and stored by this agency. The Sixth Amendment is frequently ignored as police agencies and prosecutors increasingly coerce those accused of crimes into cutting deals instead of receiving the proper trial they are guaranteed. The Fifth Amendment is ignored also through this process. In many ways, our rights are being eroded by the government as new laws and regulations are created and imposed. Most of the new regulations are not really valid laws, but regulations imposed by various agencies through administrative decree rather than through a legitimate legislative process. By continually looking the other way, and by allowing others to lead the legislative process, we are actually permitting the loss of these rights. Only by standing up to the bully can the bully be defeated. The ideals of the United Nations are not the same ideals this nation was founded upon. If the anti-gun interests succeed in their attempts to disarm the people of this nation, then there will be nothing to prevent the complete loss of the Bill of Rights and eventually our Constitution. And this is the true goal of the anti-gun movement. It is not the reduction of crime, because statistical evidence proves that this is impossible to accomplish. The bottom line in this discussion of the Second Amendment is that the Bill of Rights is part of our Constitution. These 10 amendments are part of one single document. If we're not willing to secure the right to keep and bear arms, why would we be willing to secure any other right guaranteed us by the U.S. Constitution to its citizens? The U.S. Constitution is not a place where you can choose what you feel comfortable with and discard the rest. It is an all or none place. Rejection of one of our rights enumerated in the U.S. Constitution will eventually lead to the loss of all those rights. And of course, once the Bill of Rights is pretty much tossed by the wayside because of our desire to avoid confrontation or hurt somebody's feelings, eventually we're going to have what this nation fought so hard to defeat in the first place. And that's really what it boils down to, is security and peace of the individual. When the individual is gone, all you have is the government. And that's the ultimate goal of these communities or individuals or groups or whatever you want to call them in their battle to eliminate these rights. It's to eliminate our Constitution, thus making us slaves to a higher power, which ultimately will be this one global government. And that's the end of our discussion today. I've actually gone on a lot longer than I intended to, but perhaps I'll do another video and go into some more details at some future time. But we'll see what happens. Until then, keep free, keep secure, and praise the Lord. Have a good day.